Hello and good afternoon from Munich. My name is Oliver, and I will introduce the next guest for our conference, which is Jennifer Wadella. She works at Bitovi, and hello, Jennifer. Okay, so Jennifer is known for managing and leading tech teams at Bitova, and also has a long time experience with JavaScript and development and micro frontends. She's also the founder of the nonprofit organization Kansas City Women in Technology, which sounds awesome. And yeah, I guess we will have a very interesting talk now. If you take a look at the chapter of the next talk, it sounds like a little bit that we are now entering the dark side of micro frontends. Okay, Jennifer, the stage is yours.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Okay.
Yes. All right, here we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It's the morning for me, but I think I have like the light blocked off my face. Otherwise, you're just going to see the sun slowly creep up on my eyes. But I'm excited to be here with you all, regardless of where you are in the world. So yes, we are entering the dark side of micro frontends. I've given this talk for a while now. It's called The Problems Micro Frontends Won't Solve That No One Wants to Talk About. So a little context, my name is Jennifer Wadella. Like mentioned, I work at Bitovi, which is a software consultancy. I'm the VP of front-end engineering there. And I see a lot of our clients looking to micro frontends, looking to adopt them. And a lot of times I'm helping them deal with the fallout or some of the things they experience walking into it. And so when I hear a new client telling me they think they need to implement micro frontends, this is often what my reaction looks like. One of the great and terrible things about the tech industry is we have conferences like these and we talk about these new things and we get really, really excited. And there's a lot of fun stuff going on, especially in front-end development, that you might hear about at a conference and then you run home to implement, the next week without really thinking about if this technical solution is a good fit for your organization. I've had numerous clients have some, lead architect or somebody attend some sort of a conference, hear about micro frontends, think they are the most amazing concept in the world that's going to solve absolutely all of their problems. They go down this pathway, they start implementing micro frontends, start to run into some pretty serious consequences from those choices. And so that's the basis of this talk today is what I've seen, what the reality can often look like for teams, and things that you need to be aware of if you are considering adopting micro frontends. Because again, you might, run home from this conference and say, hey, there's this whole conference lineup of people talking about micro frontends and how amazing everyone's doing them. They're going to solve all of our problems. And I'm here to tell you, no, they are not. This is not going to be a bashing on micro frontends talk. This is simply going to be a look at what the reality of implementing micro frontends looks like and things you need to be aware of before making this decision for your organization. Maybe you're already down the micro frontend pathway and you're looking for a little bit of solidarity or therapy, that you're not the only one experiencing these issues, which I hope you'll get from this talk as well. But we describe micro frontends as an architectural style where independently deliverable applications are composed into a greater whole. I'm pulling a lot of concepts today from the speakers that you've heard from in this lineup, the actual geniuses in micro frontend architecture and implementation. But what I want to talk about some of those concepts and the way they impact what I see in software delivery teams a lot. So there's some core ideas behind micro frontends, and these are solid. The idea of being able to be technology agnostic, isolating team code, establishing team prefixes, favoring native browser features over custom APIs, and ultimately building a resilient site. And these are all great core ideas. However, these are core ideas that, favor people who have been building JavaScript applications for the last decade. If you're like me, where you've been a front-end developer since the jQuery days, like this is our domain, this is our play space. We have been building single-page applications. We've been writing JavaScript for the web for a very long time, and we know the problems that we've run into, and we've started to solve a lot of those problems. And so the idea of micro frontends built on these core ideas is great for those experienced JavaScript developers who are used to shipping for the web. The reality is the teams that I see shipping software are not necessarily front-end developers who've been doing this for a decade. I work with a lot of clients that, have a back-end team and maybe one front-end developer with experience, and you throw them into an architecture with micro frontends. And these are people who are, not experienced with web performance or have any idea what native browser features are, trying to build micro frontends, and teams can start to run into roadblocks really quickly. We've also evolved a lot as a JavaScript ecosystem. We are favoring frameworks now. We have React, we have Angular, we have Vue, we have Svelte. We have all these different frameworks that have abstracted around these core concepts and built a lot of functionality for us that we very rarely interact with native browser APIs anymore. We interact with abstractions. And so we have an entire generation of front-end developers who never have written vanilla JavaScript. They have never actually bound a click event to the DOM outside of the way they would do it through Angular or React. And so we're setting up a lot of these software engineers to have expectations of something they've never dealt with before because they grew up in the framework years. So it can become very difficult and very restrictive to have a team of even, more seasoned front-end engineers that's only ever dealt in frameworks try and implement and then solve some of the problems that arise when we start adopting micro frontends. But again, this is not a bashing micro frontends talk. Like, I do think there are really great viable problems that micro frontends can solve. The number one I see is incremental upgrades. I come from the Angular world, and so I don't know how familiar you are with Angular, but if you have an Angular JS application, which is, by the way, no longer supported by Google, you basically have to do a full application rewrite to move into modern Angular. There are some small things that you can do along the way, some upgrade processes that make it easier, but most of the time, this is going to be a full application rewrite. And so one of the really powerful things we can do with micro frontends is do incremental upgrades through using the strangler pattern. We can basically partition off pieces of our application, rewrite it as we go into micro frontends. And so instead of, going to our business team, going to our product owners and saying, hey, we need 6 months to 2 years where we're not going to ship any new features, we're just going to rewrite our application. You can do it in smaller pieces, and a lot of times that's a more palatable sell to a business team. So incremental upgrades are a great use case for micro frontends. The idea of being able to ship pieces of an application independently. Maybe you already have a lot of autonomous teams. They get a lot of really great user feedback. They really understand what they're building. They're able to ship features faster if they're dealing in a micro frontend architecture where they can focus on just what they've done, deploy those small sections, and this enables teams to have smaller, more incremental development. That is a really, really great use case for the organizations that are already set up to do this effectively. This also allows us to have more product-focused teams. I love the idea of product-focused teams that can more narrowly have their focus on pieces of the application. I talk about, the difficulties of software engineering a lot, and it's not just writing the code, but it's understanding the product that we're building and then being able to write good code for that. And sometimes we're dealing with very advanced business scenarios. My big example here is I'm from the US. Our insurance system is a nightmare. Not only do we have to pay a lot of money for our health insurance and still might end up bankrupt from a hospital visit, but registering for insurance is an absolute nightmare. There's so many different rules and regulations that change from state to state, different options that are available depending on different things that your company may offer that you can pick from. It's very robust, complex business logic that you need to understand. And so the great thing with more product-focused teams is they can take more narrow pieces of an entire application and really get a deep understanding of a small area they're working on, get feedback from a user just regarding that, and really be able to write code and create the best experience possible featured around a specific part of that product. So I love the idea that we can narrow our focus and really, own the domain of whatever piece of our application that we're dealing with. And micro frontends do enable us to do that successfully. Micro frontends also, in theory, allow for autonomous teams. JavaScript developers, we are picky and we are notoriously fickle. We want to write in whatever our framework flavor of choice is. So micro frontends would support the ability for various teams to write part of the application in Angular, part of the application in Vue, part of the application in React. And I think this does sound very, very appealing from a hiring aspect. Maybe you have a more seasoned Angular team, but you're hiring some people and they either have more Vue or React experience and they could get up and running more quickly, building this new part of your application in a different framework. There is a little bit of appeal there. We'll talk about the downsides of that later on, but this is something that micro frontend architecture does open the door for us to use. And there are a lot of companies using micro frontends and a lot of companies using micro frontends successfully. So I want to make that clear. Again, this is not a bashing micro frontends talk. This is simply a, you hear about the glamour and, oh, how amazing they are. This is the reality of what things could look like when you start to go down the implementation route for micro frontends. We've got a lot of different micro frontend approaches. Micro frontends are not technically a new concept. We just have a fancy name for it now, but we've been doing micro frontends since iframes were invented. And sometimes iframes are still the most viable solution depending on your company needs. We can do server-side compilation where we are, maybe having some sort of Java backend where we're loading up different pieces of our JavaScript based on routes there. We've got stitching frameworks like SingleSpa, which I'm a huge advocate of if you're just learning and getting started about micro frontends. We've got module federation and Webpack. Vercel is looking to multi-zones. And then we can use straight up web components for micro frontend architecture. I've got an example library here that's become really popular called React to Web Component, where people are starting to use this to be able to take pieces of the React application and then use it in a micro frontend architecture by converting them to web components. And then a little old school, but Angular Elements tried to do this many, many years ago. Didn't quite pick up the speed that we thought, but it is there and it is an option for being able to pull out components of your Angular architecture and use them other places. So if you're still like, hey, Jennifer, I don't care what you said. I'm like all hyped up on this conference. Micro frontends sound awesome. I'm just going to tune out the rest of your talk. Whatever, let's go. I would caution you and say, all right, hang on, you little Frankensteins. Because again, I want to share with you some of the realities that teams start to experience when going down the micro frontend architecture pathway. They can start to run into some really serious issues and organizational problems when they think they can just start to piece together pieces of a front end and get away with one cohesive whole product at the end of the day. So I want to walk you through a couple scenarios that I have seen happen on clients and may or may not have had successful resolutions to them. You've probably heard this a lot, but micro frontends are very, very dynamic. There's not necessarily a one size fits all for different organizations. And so I don't have an answer to a lot of these that doesn't start with, well, it depends on your company and your organization. So let's say we have a new team. They're working on a new feature inside of a micro frontend. This is a brand new team. They don't have a whole lot of context into the code base, but because we have micro frontends, they can basically start building their own thing from scratch and not have to worry about it. Well, what's actually probably going to happen is that team inadvertently replicates code. They know they need to make a request for login information. They need to make a couple different requests for, different data sets. But those calls are already being made for similar data throughout other micro frontends. So they're all excited. They go ahead and they ship their application, but all of a sudden the whole application performance tanks. Okay. Because we've added more code, we've added more API calls, and it can be really hard to figure out what's going on, where that performance issue is coming from when you've got this new piece coming into play. And then who's to say the new features that this team is working on are less important than some of the already existing features? How do you prioritize who should be responsible for curing those performance issues? It's going to depend on your organization. It's going to depend on your business. It's going to depend on, how you all want to structure and handle these things. The point here is this is something that very likely may happen to you that you need to be thinking about. And hopefully before it happens and before all of a sudden your users are very, very upset after a release because the application has become unusable and nobody's quite sure why. All right, scenario number 2. We've got a critical bug that gets logged in over the weekend. Maybe there's an offshore QA team. They're running a whole bunch of manual tests every so often, and there's this really critical show-stopping bug. But as far as the QA team is concerned, they're just dealing with one entire application. They have no concept of micro frontends. They just know this bug happened. and they report it. But who gets that bug? What does that reporting funnel look like? Like if that bug gets logged, how is it going to get to the right team? Are they going to be able to determine which team or which part of the code that bug came from? These are really real issues that you're going to run into with kind of sourcing where issues are coming from, and then making sure that you have the communication and infrastructure in place for when those bugs get logged, they can get funneled to the right place. I will say I was helping a larger company with they were doing a massive upgrade. So it did make sense for Micro Frontends, but they lacked a lot of organization and architectural overhead. And so what happened was we would get a bug in, there was no way to direct it to the right team, and it kind of just went and got forgotten about. And then we went through another release, and these bugs kept popping up. And then we got into some real serious issues because we had a backlog of over 20 bugs that were just kind of sitting there. Nobody really knew what to do or what to handle with them, but they started causing really critical application performance. And then it became a nights and weekends, all hands on deck situation to try and figure out what's going on, simply because it wasn't thought out ahead of time of what to do and how to direct these bugs appropriately when they got logged. All right, scenario number 3. This is a case where, we've got autonomous teams working. They're focused on an area of their products. They're getting really great user feedback. But what happens is the UX team dreams up a brilliant new design. Maybe it's, something new on a date time picker. And they're like, oh, this is really going to revolutionize how we do things. The dev team's really excited about it. They're all bought into this design. So they go ahead and they implement it in their micro front end. But now their micro front end has a different look and feel from the rest of the application, and it's very jarring. So they might have this really great idea and they write this special component for it, but it's going to look different from the rest of the whole cohesive application. So how should they handle that? Do they throw their new design out the window? Do they figure out how to orchestrate that design and have everybody else adopt it across their micro front ends? Again, this is going to depend on you and your organization and how to implement things. Scenario number 4, we've got another micro front-end team. It's a fairly isolated team working on a very complex part of the application. They get a massive change request that comes in. And so they have to basically throw all their sprint work out the window because this is a very urgent change request that needs to happen. So they work really hard on that, and that's the only thing they're focused on, and they go ahead and they get that shipped. Everything's fine. Their unit tests are passing, but in their franticness, they shipped a breaking change for another app that had a dependency on them. Who takes control of this situation? Who is in charge here? I'm going to talk later about how you can start to solve these issues. But again, I want to highlight these at the beginning so you're thinking about the kind of problems you may run into ahead of time if you haven't already implemented micro front ends, and be able to be ahead of the curve here and say, okay, well, if our apps are going to have dependencies on each other, what are we going to do about that? What happens if they break? How are we going to handle that? Whose team is going to take responsibility for that? Or if something absolutely has to break because we need to change something, how are we going to handle that across different micro front ends with different isolated dev teams working on them? All right, scenario number 5. We have a team and they are using module federation. This is a more inexperienced team. They've got maybe one somewhat seasoned front-end developer. They've got a lot of back-end developers who don't have a lot of JavaScript experience. They're dealing with an environment where they're trying to update module federation, and they get an error that looks like this. I'll give you a couple seconds to read it. I'm betting some of you are incredibly experienced JavaScript developers, TypeScript developers. And I want you to think to yourself, how would I debug this? This is an actual error that one of our client teams ran into that sucked easily weeks of a senior JavaScript developer's time trying to figure out where this bug came from. This is a very real situation. This was a team that was using module federation with Next.js. They were trying to upgrade Next.js to 13 because they really wanted to take advantage of the new app router and server components. But their team was getting these untraceable errors. These are really, really difficult for even a senior engineer. And so if you're leaning into some of these technology solutions, you need to be aware that your team could get roadblocks by something like this. And a lot of times, these tools and these different libraries that we're using are moving so quickly that documentation maybe isn't there. If you have a team that struggles reading documentation, let alone jumping into source code to try and figure out what's going on, which is a very real gap that I see as consultants, is the struggle with A, documentation, but then B, complete lack of ability to go and look at source code when the documentation isn't there. That's a real serious blocker for a team. And, I've seen this come up in GitHub issues where there aren't resolutions. It gets ignored for weeks or months. So you are tying critical architecture, critical business blocking decisions to something like this, where we're dealing with different things that weren't necessarily ever meant to go or work together. You could run into a really, really bad scenario that is going to effectively just completely roadblock your team. And then you're going to be on the hook to, your project managers, your senior leadership saying, hey, why can't we get that stuff out the door? Why can't we ship it? Well, we don't know how. It's not a great look. Not a great look. All right, scenario number 6. This is a fun one. We've got a mid-level engineer on a feature team, and they encounter a weird Zone.js error. So for those of you who are not Angular developers in the room, Angular's change detection is built on a library called Zone.js. And the most seasoned advanced Angular developers I know don't touch Zone.js. Zone.js is a complex black box of magic that just works. We don't touch it. We don't want to touch it. But one of the very early errors you start to run into with having multiple Angular applications running in parallel in a micro frontend architecture is starting to deal with Zone.js issues. And so if you've got very seasoned engineers who aren't experienced dealing with this, they're going to really struggle debugging any of these issues, especially when they're developing in a standalone application framework and it's running fine. So there's so much we take for granted with modern frameworks. We have solved so many issues, and we can focus on the business. We can focus on understanding the business logic of what we need to write and just write functional code against that. We don't have to worry about making change detection work properly or anything like that. But when we shift into a micro frontend architecture where we start to pull back from a lot of these really great niceties that the modern frameworks offer us, we lose that. And now all of a sudden we are spending a lot more of our time again solving these JavaScript basic issues of things that we've taken for granted or never even had to think about before in our careers. All right. Next up, we've got scenario number 7. A team undertakes a monolithic application rewrite using the strangler pattern. Again, this is what I've seen clients use. This is a good solution as long as they've thought through how they're going to approach this appropriately. Because the reality of what happens is something like this. They start building out these different micro frontends. They figure out, how to go ahead and get those shipped and out the door. But if there's no process or project management, it's really difficult to tell what's been done. So let's say you have like this massive monolithic application that you're trying to rewrite. You've broken it down into these different pieces. But if you don't have that documented, if you don't have that publicly available for people to say, okay, team A, comprised of individuals, A, B, and C, is owning this piece of it. If there are bugs here, if there are UX concerns or discrepancies here, I know it's tied to that team. That's part of it. But then also, what is the status of these micro frontends? If you are looking at this huge application upgrade, how do you tell what's new code and what's old code? I was on this client project, and the only way we were able to do it, because none of this was documented, is QA or UX had to get on the phone with the developer. That developer literally had to pop open DevTools, look at that production instance, and then try and guess from the code whether that had been rewritten or not. So these are real problems that you start to run into if you have not thought ahead of time about how you're going to communicate clearly, how you're going to document, how you're going to report status of what this upgrade is and what these different micro front-end pieces, their status of completion are. Because that's the only way you're going to be able to assure quality or even know how much of the uplift effort is left to do. So what problems can't micro frontends solve? The crux of this talk. Micro frontends are not going to help you write better code. I'm sorry, that's the thing. Shipping good, small, maintainable, clean code is hard. These are hard problems to solve. Micro frontends can help a little bit, but they're not a silver bullet. They are not going to make everything magic for your team overnight. Micro frontends are not necessarily going to help you with sharing code. This is what I hear a lot of times that makes me facepalm with my clients. They're like, oh, well, we don't want to rewrite, or we don't want to do this. For some reason, they don't want to use a shared component library or something like that. And 9 times out of 10, when I'm hearing about, sharing code issues, mono repo, just use a mono repo. Go use NX. They provide brilliant tooling for mono repo support. Mono repo is not a bad word, especially when it comes to sharing code in a pragmatic way. Look into it. Application performance. I've heard this more than once, typically from some sort of technical leadership with no front-end experience that's heard about micro frontends and thinks they're going to be a good way to go. Application performance is not going to get better with micro frontends. You're going to be doing everything more. You're going to be shipping more JavaScript to the browser. You're going to be loading more frameworks. You're going to be making more API requests. All these things are going to get you less performance. My small caveat here is, okay, maybe you're doing something like running on a very old version of WordPress, and you're going to rewrite that into micro frontends. Okay, you've got me there. Yes, you would get better application performance, but most of the time when I'm hearing this from clients, they already have, JavaScript running in the browser, some sort of more modern approach, and they think that micro frontends are the secret trick to better performance. Not the case. What problems are micro frontends probably going to cause? A lot, unless you've heard this talk and started to think through these things ahead of time. They will likely cause you bloat to duplicated code. It's very hard to manage the code that's written across all of these different and disparate teams. So there might be times that code is rewritten and you get bloat from that. There's going to be increased difficulty maintaining code quality. I have had clients before that want to use micro frontends because they are very protective about like secret new features and code names and things like that. And so they want everything isolated in a different repo where other people can't touch. But then it can become very difficult to maintain code quality and standards across the board if everybody's developing in a silo where they can't see what other people are doing. Again, mentioned this already, but you're going to start to run into performance problems. You'll run into responsibility confusion. This is at the QA level. This is at the UX level. This is at the, okay, if an error happens, who's responsible? Okay, if performance tanks, who's responsible? Who has to go clean that up? You're going to run into responsibility confusion. You're also going to run into upgrade roadblocks. Again, it's a very exciting time to be in front-end development and be in the micro front-end space, but we're dealing with a lot of new tools and technologies. They are not as bulletproof as a lot of my clients often think they are. And like that module federation problem that I saw that team roadblock by, this is something to be aware of as you're going to you're going to run into upgrade roadblocks. You're also going to run into having to solve the same front-end problems again that we've been solving for the last decade. And I'll talk a little bit more about that now, because instead of new problems to solve, we have old problems to solve that had already been solved using one framework for one application. When you go into micro frontend, you are having to think about routing all over again. I can deal with never writing a router again in my career. It's the same as writing a jQuery slider. Like, we've done it a million times. People who are much smarter, who have entire teams dedicated to this, have built better, more robust solutions. Do you really want to have to build a router again? Something you're going to have to think about with adopting micro frontends. Cross-app communication. We need to figure out what is the best way to communicate between our different apps. I reference this a lot if you're talking about cross-framework like Angular and React. Angular, we very heavily rely on RxJS for communication, for pub sub libraries, and all sorts of things. It's very normal and very native to us, but other developers across other frameworks who haven't been using RxJS for the last several years, that's a huge learning curve if that's something you're going to look at adopting. Bloat, again, due to duplicated code. All these great builders and things we've done to minify our code and make things really, really easy, well, that kind of gets chucked out the window when we might be dealing with, the same code across different micro frontends. I will say I had a client reach out to me that they were looking at implementing a micro frontend architecture because they were struggling to upgrade one of their Angular versions. And so they just wanted to rewrite a piece of their app in the new Angular version and go from there. And I'm like, you really want to ship 2 different versions of Angular to your browser? This is the easy solution that you want to go for? Not a good idea. Sharing common code. Again, if you've got utility libraries or things like that, how are you going to share those across different micro frontends, especially if you're in a bunch of disparate repos? Maintaining consistent style in UX, handling deployment automation. We've got a lot of really great, really nice built-in tools now for deploying in any manner for our different frameworks. Well, now we have to figure out a lot of different dependencies again. We need to worry about code quality maintenance. We need to worry about how to handle breaking changes between applications. Here's a really fun one that I think gets a lot of people is with micro frontends. All we're doing is putting JavaScript in the browser and then ripping it back out again when we're not done. But there are really specific things that frameworks handle for us, like cleaning up on teardown, removing event handlers, that as soon as we walk away from the frameworks handling all this for you, this is a thing you need to think about. And if you're not an experienced JavaScript developer who's been dealing with, native APIs and dealing with event binding since before the framework years, you might not even know this is a concept because you've never had to. But all of a sudden, you can end up with some really serious memory leaks if this is something that you're not even aware you need to be thinking about with your micro frontend architecture. We need to figure out how we're going to handle testing. What does end-to-end testing look like? How does that break down across micro frontends? Maybe you've got a team that shifted left really successfully and they're, writing their end-to-end tests alongside shipping code. Well, what's the breakdown between micro frontends and how do we keep those tests from being duplicated and not bloating our test run times? So is there a way to adopt micro frontends and profit? I hope so. I hope so. And that's what I want to help you do. So how can we adopt micro frontends and triumph? How can we adopt micro frontends and not deal with all these horrible scenarios that I've shared with you that I've seen clients run into? So number one is understanding your team's limits. Like I talked about, a lot of these concepts are really solid, but they are also concepts that are going to be very normal for people who've been building JavaScript applications for the last decade and who are very familiar with native DOM APIs and understand how to build for the web from before the React and the Angular days. So understanding where your team's skill level is at. What are their foresight capabilities? Are they going to be able to choose tools and libraries that are going to last? And then if they're dealing with more modern tools that aren't as tested, are they going to be able to debug their way out of breaking changes? So you need to understand where your team's at, and then you need to make sure you're considering your tools and approaches accordingly. If you've got a less experienced front-end team, you should not be going and implementing the latest and greatest that the best JavaScript minds are talking about at conferences, because you may not be able to do it as successfully as they do, lacking that level of experience. You need to focus on communication. Consumer-driven contracts are a really great way to go here. Creating contracts between teams, between micro frontends to say, hey, these are our responsibilities. This is how we're going to communicate. This is who's responsible for what. This is what we're going to do if something breaks or if something needs to change. And then you also need to foster opportunities to collaborate across verticals. You need people in high technical leadership positions that have oversight into all the moving pieces to help bridge those communication gaps and spot dysfunctions and make sure that the right contracts are in place. You need to prioritize collaboration. So this is a great quote from Michael that I'm going to reference here again if you haven't heard it already. Agree on naming conventions where isolation is not possible yet. Namespace, CSS, events, local storage, and cookies to avoid collisions and clarify ownership. These are decisions you need to make ahead of time, make sure everybody is aware of, and make sure are documented. So that way, if you hire a new team to build a new micro front end, they're not going to go rogue and do all this different stuff. They're going to have the documentation available to follow these naming conventions and patterns that your team has prioritized to collaborate on. You need to figure out deployment. This is a huge sticking point. I say that micro frontends are only as good as your ability to successfully and seamlessly deploy them. If you're an organization or a company that doesn't have good CI/CD infrastructure in the first place, if it is a nightmare to deploy an application, it's going to be a huge nightmare deploying more than one application, because you need infrastructure per micro frontend that you're going to deploy. You need, fallback practices for what's going to happen. What if something goes down? What if something doesn't ship successfully? How does that impact the rest of the application? There's a lot that needs to be handled on the DevOps side regarding deployment for you to successfully adopt micro frontend architecture. You need to commit to documentation. I see teams in one code base, one front end that suck at documentation. This is only going to get worse at scale. So you need to really advocate for your team to be documenting code styles, dependencies, deployment flows, everything. Because the reality is this: we break into these autonomous teams, we're shipping micro frontends, that's great. But maybe there's a team and work has scaled down. There's no features to be built for that micro front end. And so that team gets disbanded, and then they go and they help these other micro front end teams that have more features and more development. Like, that's how we move resources around. Well, if you don't have your micro front end documented, you're literally putting your developers through a new hire onboarding process all over again. They need to relearn how your team is doing things, understand how to function. And so, onboarding one developer is hard enough. Some companies, this takes 6 months. Are you going to do that kind of onboarding per micro front end? It can be a real nightmare and a real time suck. So the better you are at your documentation, the more successfully your organization is going to be for team members to transition and contribute to micro front ends and the reality of the way things end up working out regarding priorities and feature development. You should also have experts on call for backup. Obviously, there are a whole bunch of brilliant consultants at this conference speaking here today. My company, we're happy to be your experts as well, because your team might get stuck. And so if you get stuck, you don't want to be going to a senior VP being like, well, we can't ship because we have this vague TypeScript error that we don't know what to deal with. Make sure that you can call in some consultants, somebody who's very, very experienced, who can help you out of a hard situation if you get stuck. Big picture, modern micro front-end tooling is still very, very new. There's so much evolving. It's really, really exciting, but I cannot understate how untested robustly some of these tools are. So you may see a lot of talk and you may see a lot of hype about these things, but that does not mean this is something that you are not going to run into undocumented scenarios or GitHub bugs or issues that have been open for months. This is a very real reality you need to be aware of. There is no singular micro front-end solution. I can't give you a list of best practices or one single tool that's going to solve all your needs, because those don't exist yet. Micro front-ends are so organization dependent, based on how you're structured, what problems you're trying to solve. So this one single solution doesn't exist yet and possibly might not exist ever. Micro frontends are here to help us solve business problems, not technical ones. Being able to ship features more quickly, that's a business problem, not a technical one. Being able to have more focused product teams, again, that's a business problem, not a technical one. If your problem isn't directly related to a product or business need, you probably or might not need micro frontends. I do have a lot of helpful resources listed here, and I'll link these slides after, so you don't have to worry about recording these or anything like that. But here's the slide. These slides are available at microfrontendproblems.jenniferwadella.com. There's a QR code if you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn, if you need to either trauma dump about your micro front-end experience, or if you are needing help or just somebody to ask questions to. I'm happy to help you in whatever capacity I can. So that is what I have for you today. I hope you can go down this micro front-end architecture pathway successfully, armed with some of the problems that you might run into, and be able to get ahead of the curve and think through some of those. So thank you so much for having me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the conference, you lovely human beings.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Very interesting talk. We got a couple of questions, so we are a little bit hard on time, so maybe we cannot show all the questions. Here's the first one. Daniel is asking, as you mentioned, there are often instances where you feel a company isn't ready to implement micro frontends for a solution. What are the milestones flags that indicates a company is mature enough to support it?
Yeah, so I think number one is going to be, an experienced team of front-end engineers that have been, writing code for a lot longer than just React or just Angular or something like that. DevOps is going to be the other big one. Like, is there a good DevOps team in place that really knows what they're doing, that deployments are really easy and really seamless, and then they're going to be able to do and replicate that at scale? Those are two of the biggest ones. And then the other thing is, you've got to have good project management in place. You've got to have good technical leadership in place to kind of make sure that all the pieces are coming together. This is not something that can just be done in silo development. That's a way to go down for disaster. So you need, good business good software development practices in place to then be able to do, one front end, let alone micro front ends at scale.
Okay, the next question. Karthik wants to know, just curious to know, what was the problem behind cannot read property of undefined reading code?
You know what? I don't even know if I remember. So this is an active client that we still have, and it was one of my teams working on it. I don't actually remember what the issue was, and I'm pretty sure they've run into it more than just that one time. Yeah, it's that big.
Maybe another guy can answer it in the chat.
Nobody's going to be able to answer that in the chat. That's impossible to debug. So,
okay, just a hint. The last question comes from Disislava. What ES build tools do you have integrated for deployment? Sorry.
I'm not sure if I understand that question, because I don't have this isn't one project. I'm speaking from a collective experiences of a bunch of different projects, and I don't know if any of them have used ES Build off the top of my head.
Okay. Thank you, Jennifer, for being here and to enlighten us. And